The scent hit him first. Sharp. Familiar. Old. The kind of scent that doesn't announce itself politely. It just arrives and takes up all the space in your lungs until there's no room left for anything else. Orion Beaumont's steps slowed on the park path. His hand was still wrapped around Kael Fontaine's fingers, warm from the afternoon sun, and the whole day had been easy. Soft talk about centerpieces, about venues, about whether the reception should end before midnight or push past it. About the small things that people talk about when they've finally stopped watching their backs. Easy, quiet, safe. Orion had spent 3 years building that feeling. 3 years earning the right to walk through a park on a Sunday afternoon without his pulse climbing. He'd done the work. Walked away from the wrong rooms, the wrong people, the wrong version of himself. He'd built something real with Kael. Something solid that didn't creak when you leaned on it. And the ring on his finger was proof that the past had finally, genuinely, stayed behind him. That's what he had believed, until that scent cut straight through all of it. Kael kept walking 2 steps before he noticed Orion had stopped. He turned, looked at him. His jaw was set the way it always was, calm, controlled, reading the room without appearing to. But his dark eyes were watching Orion's face the way they always watched when something shifted. "You good?" Kael asked. Orion didn't answer, because across the park, past the joggers, past the woman with the double stroller, past the group of teenagers sprawled out on the grass, on a wooden bench half-tucked under the shade of an old oak tree, a man sat hunched forward with his elbows on his knees. Thin, too thin. His jacket hung off his frame like it belonged to someone built differently, someone who used to be fuller. His head was low. His shoulders were tight. And even from this distance, even across the open stretch of park path between them, Orion could see the particular kind of exhaustion in the line of his neck that wasn't just tired. That was survival exhaustion. The kind that lives in your bones. 3 children sat beside him. 3. Identical. They were small, maybe 4, maybe 5. Lined up in a neat, careful row on the bench like they'd been taught to stay still and stay quiet, and had obeyed that lesson so many times it had become reflex. All 3 in the same cheap off-white sweaters. All 3 watching the pigeons on the ground with blank, patient eyes. Not bored. Not distracted. Just waiting. That's what it looked like. Children who had learned that waiting was a skill. Orion's chest locked up completely. He didn't breathe. One of the children turned. Looked directly across the park. Looked directly at him. Gray eyes. The precise shade of gray. The exact particular tone. The one Orion saw every single morning when he stood in front of his bathroom mirror and tried to figure out what the day was going to ask of him. His brain started doing the math immediately and his body tried to stop it. Hi viewers. Have you ever had one of those moments where your entire life felt completely figured out, completely settled, right up until the exact second it wasn't? Drop a comment because what's about to happen to Orion is the kind of thing nobody has a plan for. The man on the bench lifted his head. Riven Calloway. Orion hadn't said that name out loud in 3 years. He hadn't written it down or typed it or even let it fully form in his head, because the name came attached to too many things. Things he'd worked hard to pack away. Things he'd gotten real good at not touching. And now Riven was right here, alive and present and real, sitting in the same park, on the same Sunday, and the expression on Riven's face when his eyes found Orion was not relief and it was not surprise. It was pure, cold, undisguised fear. He stood immediately. His hands moved to the children in one practiced motion, pulling all 3 of them in close, one arm sweeping across like a barrier. Automatic. Protective. Like a reflex he had built through repetition. Like he had done this specific movement so many times that his muscles knew it before his brain gave the instruction. All 3 children pressed into him without question. They had been trained for this too. Orion's feet moved before his mind caught up. The path crunched under his shoes. The distance between them collapsed in slow motion. Kael was right behind him. Not grabbing, not stopping him. Just present, a wall of quiet that moved when Orion moved. Riven. His voice came out rough. Barely a full word. Just the shape of the name, scraped out of a place in his throat that hadn't been used in a long time. Riven's jaw tightened. His eyes cut left, right, down the path, past the tree line, toward the park entrance. He was running the exits. Orion recognized it because he'd watched Riven do it in rooms before. Years ago, in a different life. Kael stepped slightly to the left without speaking. Not blocking, not threatening, just placing himself where he could see everything at once, which was exactly the kind of move that most people didn't notice and that certain other people recognized immediately. Riven recognized it. He went very still. The smallest child, the one sitting closest to where Riven had been looking, turned fully around on the bench and looked at Orion with no expression at all. Just those gray eyes. Clear and direct and old in a way that eyes that small had no business being. Orion stopped walking 2 feet away from the bench. He looked at Riven. Riven looked back at him. For years of silence standing between them like a physical object. And then, quiet enough that the wind nearly swallowed it entirely, Riven said, "You weren't supposed to find us." The smallest child slipped out from under Riven's arm in the same second. For quick steps across the dry grass. No hesitation. No checking back. Completely certain of the direction. Completely certain of the destination. He stopped directly in front of Orion and looked straight up, and the steadiness in that small face was something Orion would never forget for the rest of his life. He said it clean and clear, the way children say things when they don't know yet that some words are supposed to be complicated. "Papa." The word hit Orion like a car hitting a wall. He didn't move. Couldn't move. His lungs had stopped remembering what they were supposed to do. Behind him, Kael had gone absolutely, completely still, and Kael Fontaine was never completely still. That man was always processing, always calculating, always running 3 moves ahead. Still meant something had broken through. Riven closed his eyes. Just for 1 second. The way someone closes their eyes when the thing they've been dreading for years finally walks up the driveway and knocks on the door. The way you close your eyes when the weight of a decision you made a long time ago finally, fully lands. Then he opened them. And Orion was still standing there. Still staring. Still trying to fit the shape of what was in front of him into a version of reality that he could hold without dropping everything else. The other 2 children were watching from the bench. Nobody in the park around them had noticed yet. The joggers kept jogging. The pigeons kept eating. The afternoon kept being an afternoon. And everything had just changed. The child's hand was already reaching up. Small fingers stretching toward Orion's sleeve. Patient. Certain. Not demanding, just reaching the way children reach for things they believe belong to them. Orion looked down at those fingers and felt every logical thing in his brain stop working in sequence. His timeline. His dates. The last months he and Riven had shared the same space. The progression of weeks. The math of it tried to arrange itself and kept arriving at a number that didn't make sense. And then suddenly it did, and the arrival of that sense was worse than the confusion. His heat cycles. The last stretch of their relationship, when everything had already been pulling apart at the seams. When Orion had been so busy managing the chaos around him that he hadn't paid attention to what was happening in his own body. When Riven had started going quiet in ways that felt like withdrawal but maybe had been fear of a completely different kind. "Move to the other bench," Kael said, close to Orion's ear. "Away from the path. Now." Not harsh. Not loud. Just directed, the way Kael got when he needed something done without creating a scene. It was the voice he used in boardrooms when a deal was going sideways and everyone needed to pretend it wasn't. Riven picked up the child. The gray-eyed one, the one who'd said it, and tucked him against his chest like he was something irreplaceable because he was. The other 2 slid off the bench and moved immediately to either side of him, flanking him, one small hand gripping each side of his jacket. The motion was too synchronized for coincidence. They had been taught to move together. Staying in formation was something these children understood the way other children understood how to share toys or take turns. They moved to the far bench, tucked further back from the main path, half shielded by a hedge that had gotten overgrown through September. Orion sat down. He didn't remember choosing to. Kael remained standing, slightly behind, slightly to the left. Close enough to be present, far enough to give the conversation the air it needed. His phone came out. Orion watched him look at the screen for a moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then put it away again, face blank. Whatever message had been sent or received, Kael filed it without showing the result. The 3 children arranged themselves around Riven. The gray-eyed one, who Riven had quietly called Sage when the boy reached up to adjust his own collar, sat pressed into Riven's right side. The one on the left had a small scrape on his chin that was half-healed, yellowish at the edges. The third had fallen asleep against Riven's arm with complete trust, like he'd been doing it forever, like Riven's arm was the most reliable surface in his world, because it probably was. Orion looked at Riven's face properly for the first time since the park path. He looked worn down in a way that wasn't just tired. There was a gray quality to his skin under the afternoon light. His cheekbones sat too high because his face had lost padding. His eyes carried that flat, careful steadiness that people develop when they've been on alert for so long that the edges of the alert and the edges of themselves have blurred together. "You need to start talking," Orion said. He kept his voice low, but he didn't keep the roughness out of it. "Right now, Riven." Riven looked at the ground between them. Then he looked at his hands. Then he looked at Orion. And he started. He said he had found out late in the last month of their relationship. He did not lead with an apology. He said it plainly, like a man who had rehearsed this account so many times that the emotional surface of it had worn smooth. He'd found out and he'd thought about telling Orion every single day for 2 weeks straight. He had picked up his phone more times than he could count and put it back down. He had written a message once and deleted it, because Orion's world at that time had edges that drew blood if you got too close to them. Riven didn't name the specifics. He didn't have to. Orion knew what he was talking about. The people Orion had been connected to through circumstance and bad timing. The rooms he'd walked into before he understood the cost of walking into them. The faces he'd seen and the things he'd heard that you couldn't unhear. Riven had looked at all of that. And he had looked at the pregnancy. And he had made a calculation. He left before he was showing. Packed 1 bag. Took his documents and the small amount of money he'd kept separate in an account Orion didn't know about. Not for secrecy, just for the particular kind of self-preservation that Omegas learned early and quietly. And he walked out of their city in the middle of the night. The triplets were born in a hospital 3 states away where no one knew his real surname. He'd used a variation of his mother's maiden name. He'd paid in cash where he could. He'd stayed under the surface the way you stay under the surface when you understand that the surface is where people get found. Orion's hands were flat on his thighs, pressing down hard enough that the knuckles had lost color. "I thought you had moved on," Riven said. His voice didn't crack, but it came close. Something in the rhythm of it wobbled, just slightly, before he steadied it. "I watched from a distance, just enough to know you were okay. I saw the coverage about your company, about what you were building. You had a life that looked real." He stopped. His eyes moved to Kael for the length of a breath. Then back. "I didn't want to be the thing that pulled all of it down." "They're mine," Orion said. "Yes. I had a right. I know what I took from you." Riven said it quietly, without defense in it. "I have known every single day, every birthday, every first word. Every night one of them had a fever and I was alone in a motel room trying to figure out if I should take them to an ER where someone might ask for my real ID." He paused. His throat moved. "I made a choice that wasn't fair to you. I made it because it felt like the only one that kept them alive. I'm not asking you to call it right. I'm just telling you what it was." The park noise continued around them like a border around something private. Distant children laughing. A dog barking somewhere across the grass. A food cart vendor calling out in a voice that bounced off the trees. None of it touched the 4 feet of air between Orion and Riven. Kael placed a hand on Orion's shoulder. No words. No instruction. Just weight. Steady and even and grounding in the specific way that Kael was grounding. Not pulling you back from the edge but standing close enough that you remembered the edge wasn't the only place to stand. Orion breathed in slowly. Breathed out. He looked at the 3 children. Sage looking back at him with those quiet gray eyes. The second one, Riven had called him Crew, picking at a loose thread on his sweater sleeve. The third, the one who'd been sleeping, now awake and watching with round, solemn eyes, all three of them carrying his face in pieces. An eye here, a jawline there, the exact particular slope of a forehead. Riven looked directly at Kael. First time he'd done it without flinching. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. "You didn't know any of this existed an hour ago. You could walk away from this right now and it would not be your problem." Kael was quiet for exactly the amount of time it takes a person who measures their words to measure them. "Because if someone is hunting alpha heirs," he said, flat and final, "this is already my war." Kael didn't react. That was the thing about him that took Orion the longest to understand. Most people, when they heard something that size, someone is looking for them, let it land on their face first. A blink, a sharp breath, the small involuntary signals of a nervous system responding to threat. Kael just absorbed the information the way a thick wall absorbs impact. Completely, silently, without shifting. He straightened from his crouch, looked at Riven steadily for 3 seconds, and pulled out his phone. What he typed was short, 4 words at most. The response came back in under 10 seconds and he read it without expression, then put the phone away. He did a single slow scan of the park, left to right, tree line to entrance, bench to bench, the kind of deliberate scan that looked casual to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Orion had been watching Kael do things like this for 2 years. The quiet adjustments. The phone that never rang twice without being answered. The way he seemed to already know where the exits were in every room before anyone else had stopped looking at the decor. Orion had filed all of it under powerful man, CEO behaviors, the particular kind of vigilance that came with running something large and being responsible for it. He was beginning to understand it was more than that. The 3 children had been watching Kael since he first crouched beside them. Sage especially. He had not taken his eyes off Kael since the moment Kael moved with purpose toward the bench. There was no fear in it, no hostility, just that same flat, precise attention Sage seemed to give to everything, like he was running a constant assessment and updating it in real time. The afternoon had gone quieter. The main crowd on the park paths had thinned. A few leaves had come down from the oak tree in the light wind, and one of them landed directly on Crew's knee, and he stared at it like it was something interesting. Then it happened fast. The third child, the one Riven called Levi, the one who had woken up from his nap and been the quietest of the 3 since, leaned forward too far from the edge of the bench trying to reach a coin on the concrete. His small weight tipped wrong. He went down. Sharp and sudden. A crack of knee on hard ground, and the sound of it made Riven lurch forward, but Kael was already there. He was down on one knee beside Levi in the same second the child hit the ground. Not running, not dramatic, just there, instantly, both large hands wrapped around the boy's small arms and holding steady before the full cry had even formed. The motion was economical, no wasted movement. The grip was firm enough to be real and gentle enough to communicate safety in the same gesture. "I've got you," Kael said, quiet, level, completely sure of itself. Levi looked up at him, eyes wet at the corners, lip trembling, the gathering storm of a proper cry sitting right behind his face. He looked at Kael's hands on his arms, then at Kael's face. The cry stayed gathered but didn't fall. Instead, slowly, like a plant turning toward something warm, Levi leaned forward and pressed his forehead directly into Kael's shoulder. Just like that, like he'd known him for years, like his body had made a decision that his 4-year-old brain hadn't been consulted on. Riven watched this from 2 feet away with an expression that moved through several things in rapid sequence. Surprise, something guarded, something that was fighting not to be hope. Kael held Levi steady. His right hand was on the child's back. Not stiff, not performative. Just present in the specific way that large people can be present with small people when they aren't trying to make a point about it. He checked the knee with his other hand. Scrape, not deep, already done bleeding. "You're all right," he said, the same quiet voice. "Just a scrape." Levi pulled back slightly, looked at the knee, nodded with the gravity of someone who has decided to be brave about it. Crew, watching from the bench, had his arms crossed and his chin lifted, which was the expression he seemed to make when he was deciding whether something was worth emotional investment. And Sage, still sitting straight on the bench, said it without fanfare, without dramatic pause, just 2 words, offered plainly as observation. Alpha, safe. The words sat in the air between all of them and didn't move. Kael looked at Sage over Levi's shoulder. Something behind his eyes shifted. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but recognition. The same kind of recognition you get when something you were told about in theory becomes something you can see with your own eyes. Sage looked back, perfectly still, not challenging, not performing, just reporting what he'd assessed. Kael set Levi back onto the bench carefully, made sure he was steady, then stood to his full height. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his usual quiet. There was something processing behind it. He turned to Orion and stepped close. This isn't coincidence. His voice was low enough that it didn't carry. His eyes were level and certain. Someone placed them here or someone already knew they were here. Either way, they've already been watched. The afternoon light came down golden through the trees and everything looked peaceful and nothing was. Riven had been running for 4 years and 3 months. He laid it out without decoration. Dates, cities, the names he had used that weren't his real name. He didn't pace. He didn't reach for sympathy. He spoke the way a person speaks after they've had to explain themselves so many times inside their own head that the emotion has been packed down under the facts, and what surfaces is just the clean, stripped shape of what happened. The first attempt had come at 6 months. A man Riven had never seen before showed up at the front door of his apartment. Not aggressive, not obviously threatening, which somehow made it worse. He asked questions that were too specific and too calm. He asked about Orion. He asked about Orion's documented biology. He asked whether Riven had any knowledge of a recent conception. He asked it like it was a reasonable question to ask a stranger at their front door. Riven closed the door, left through the building's side exit, and was out of the city before the man had cleared the block. The second city lasted 7 months. The third one only 4. He kept the children's profiles low. No social media. No school photos posted anywhere. No full names used in any public-facing context. He moved them through daycare under first names only. He paid rent in cash wherever landlords would take it. He got good at finding the landlords who would. The triplets had never stayed in one place long enough to collect the normal furniture of childhood. No best friends. No familiar teachers whose names they remembered past 2 semesters. No bedrooms they'd been allowed to paint or decorate because decorating a room meant investing in staying, and Riven had stopped letting himself do that after the second move. Sage had stopped asking why they moved after the 3rd time. Crew had followed his lead. Levi still asked sometimes, the youngest in temperament if not in birth order, and Riven always told him the same thing. New place, new adventure. Said it with enough steadiness that Levi accepted it. Said it so many times that Riven had stopped hearing how thin it sounded. "I watched you from a distance," Riven said. His voice was even, but the evenness was costing him something. Orion could hear it in the edges. "Just enough to know you were still standing. I saw the articles about the company, about what you were doing. I saw the charity work, the expansion, He stopped. His eyes moved to Kael once, brief and unreadable. "I saw the engagement announcement." Orion said nothing. "You looked like you had something real," Riven said. "Something that wasn't about surviving. I told myself that meant I'd made the right call. That the distance was protecting both of us and the kids were safer because of it." He paused. "I told myself that enough times that it started to feel like it might be true." Crew shifted on the bench beside him. Small hands folding and unfolding in his lap. He wasn't listening in a way that looked like listening, but he was listening. All 3 of them were. Children who had spent 4 years in survival mode environments developed that skill early, absorbing the room without appearing to, cataloging the tone of adult conversations before the adults finished having them. Orion looked at his hands. He pressed them flat against his knees. Then he looked up. "You should have told me," he said. Not loud, not accusatory, just true. "Yes. Even if things were dangerous. Even with all of it. You should have told me. Yes. Because those are my... Orion's voice broke slightly. He pressed through it. They're mine, Riven. Whatever was happening around me, whatever mess I was in, you didn't get to make that choice for me. You didn't get to decide I couldn't handle it. Riven took that. He didn't deflect it. He absorbed it the way Kael had absorbed the news earlier, taking the full weight of it without retreating. I know, he said. I've known since the day I left. I made the wrong choice for the right reason and I've lived with it every day since. I'm not asking you to let that be okay. I'm just asking you to believe that it was the only move I could see that kept them breathing. He looked at Sage. Crew. At Levi, who had crawled partly into his lap at some point during the last 10 minutes without anyone noticing. I would make a lot of different choices if I could go back. That one, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I'm sorry. For all of it. I am genuinely sorry. The park around them had gotten quieter. The afternoon was pulling toward early evening. The light had gone a shade warmer and longer shadows were starting to stretch across the grass. Kael placed a hand on Orion's shoulder. No instruction in it. Just wait. Steady and deliberate and grounding in the way Kael was grounding. Not steering Orion away from the emotion but standing close enough that the emotion didn't have to be carried alone. Orion breathed in. He looked at the three children. Sage watching him. Crew watching his own hands. Levi, half asleep again against Riven's side with his mouth slightly open and his brow completely smooth the way children's brows go when they've decided they're safe enough to sleep. All three of them with pieces of his face distributed between them like someone had taken a photograph of Orion and torn it carefully into sections and handed one section to each child to keep. His chest ached with a feeling that didn't have a clean name. It was grief and it was wonder and it was a specific kind of anger that wasn't really anger. It was just loss shaped like fury because loss needed somewhere to point. Riven looked directly at Kael for the first time in the conversation without looking away immediately. Why? He asked. Why are you sitting here? Why are you helping? You could have walked Orion away from this bench an hour ago and none of this would be your problem. You have every reason to. Kael's expression didn't change. Because if someone is hunting alpha heirs. He said it with the particular flatness that made certain things more unsettling, not less. This is already my war. It was already my war before I sat down. Riven stared at him. Kael looked back. And in the space between them something shifted. The beginning of an understanding neither of them put into words. The kind that forms when two people recognize that they are operating inside the same level of seriousness and neither of them is pretending otherwise. Started with one phone. Someone at the far curve of the park path, maybe 60 feet away, had their camera up at the wrong angle for a casual photo. Orion caught the glint first. That particular thin rectangle of reflected light that means a screen is pointed outward, capturing rather than displaying. He clocked it and his stomach dropped before his brain had finished labeling what it was. He saw the second 4 seconds later. Kael had already seen both. He didn't move fast. Kael never moved fast in ways that announced themselves as movement. He simply shifted direction with the kind of efficiency that didn't draw the eye, placing his frame between the cameras and the bench, and said something low to Riven that was quiet enough that only Riven and the space immediately around them could catch it. Riven moved immediately, both arms around the children, faces tucked down, collars pulled up. All three boys cooperated without question, no complaint, no confusion, because they had been through versions of this before. The practice quality of it was the most painful part. 3 children under the age of 5, executing a cover procedure like it was as normal as putting on shoes. Kael guided them off the bench and toward the tree line at an unhurried pace that looked to anyone watching like a group of people simply deciding to walk in a different direction. They were out of the park within 8 minutes. That night it was online. The footage was grainy, shot from distance, stitched from 2 angles. But the framing was enough. Orion's face was recognizable. Kael's profile was recognizable. The 3 small children flanking a thin, hollow-eyed man on a park bench were recognizable in the sense that they existed and the camera had found them. The captions started within 2 hours. One account posted, "Hidden children?" Another built a timeline. assembled out of genuine gaps and complete fabrications and arranged so confidently that the difference between them became impossible to see at a glance. The phrase Omega manipulation appeared in 4 separate posts within the first hour, used each time with the specific ease of people repeating something they've decided is already established. Wealthy CEO blindsided in public park. Secret affair surfaces years later. Abandoned triplets found. None of it was accurate. All of it was structured to sound like it was. By 10 o'clock, the original footage had 40,000 views. By midnight, the number had more than doubled and the comment sections had moved past speculation into the particular cruelty of people who feel entitled to a stranger's private life because they found it through a screen. Riven saw it from the far end of the living room in the private apartment Kael had moved them to. Efficiently, cleanly, with a level of logistical ease that made Orion aware again of exactly how much infrastructure existed behind the man he was engaged to. Riven had Levi in his lap and the other 2 pressed on either side of him, and he was reading the screen with the expression of someone watching a wall they built carefully being knocked down from a distance. He went very still. Then he put the phone face down on the cushion beside him. "I need to leave," he said. Not raised. Not desperate. Just stated the way someone states a conclusion they've already finished arguing with themselves about. Flat and decided. Sage looked up from the floor where he'd been organizing a small pile of items he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. A coin, a smooth stone, a folded piece of paper. He looked at his father's face and then he stopped organizing and just sat still. "If I go," Riven continued, "and I take the kids and I disappear again somewhere they can't connect back to either of you, this dies down. The story stops having anything to feed on. You keep your company, your reputation, your engagement. You keep the life you built." He looked at Orion. Direct. Not apologetic, not manipulative. Just honest about what he believed was the cleanest math. That's the version where the least amount gets destroyed. "No," Orion said. Riven looked at him. "That is not happening." Orion said it again, clearer, landing each word separately. "You are not taking them and running again. That ends here." Crew on the couch had his chin resting on his knees. Watching. Listening. Eyes moving between his father and Orion the way children watch adults when they understand that what the adults are deciding has weight. Orion crossed the room and crouched down in front of Sage on the floor. The boy looked at him. Those gray eyes. Up close they were even more precisely his same depth, same slight ring of darker gray at the edges. "Hey," Orion said. Sage looked at him. "You're not going anywhere," Orion said. Sage considered this for a moment with the gravity of a child who does not accept statements purely on authority. Then he gave one small nod. Decided. Orion stood up, turned to Kael. "If we protect them," he said. "If we actually stand in front of this thing instead of running from it, what does that cost you? Your name is already in those posts. Your company is going to start getting questions by morning." Kael looked at the coverage still scrolling on his phone. He looked at it for long enough that Orion couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was the way Kael looked when he was thinking the most. Then he looked at the couch. Crew and Levi asleep against each other now, still in their jackets. Levi's head tipped sideways onto his brother's shoulder. He put the phone face down on the table. "Everything," he said, "which is why we do it correctly." He said it with the particular kind of certainty that doesn't come from optimism. It comes from someone who has already calculated the cost, already decided the cost is acceptable, and is now simply executing the decision they made 3 steps ago. Outside, beyond the secured door, past the 2 men Kael had positioned in the hallway without making an announcement of it, the night was quiet. A notification lit up on a screen in a room none of them knew about. The grainy park footage, frame by frame, algorithm enhanced. A face circled. 3 small faces circled beneath it. A message composed in 11 words and sent to a contact with no registered name attached to the account. Found them. All 3 confirmed. Location being tracked. Awaiting instruction. The message was read in under 60 seconds. And a reply came back in 40. The safe house was nothing like what Riven had been expecting. He'd expected functional. He'd expected clean and cold and efficient. a space designed to solve a security problem not to be lived in. What Kael's team had arranged by 11 that night was something different. It wasn't large. It wasn't decorated. But it had a kitchen with a full set of dishes, a bathroom with towels that were actual towels and not the paper-thin motel kind, and a second room with 2 beds and a cot pushed together that someone had covered with an extra blanket that was thick and soft. Riven stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment before he moved. He had spent 4 years making do. 4 years finding ways to turn whatever space he landed in into something that felt safe enough for 3 small children to sleep in. Motels and short-term sublets, and one stretch of 8 weeks staying in a friend's cousin's spare room without the friend's cousin knowing exactly why. He had learned to make the best of spaces that were not built for permanence. This felt different. This felt like someone had thought about what 3 children needed before the children arrived. He didn't say anything about it. He just got the boys to the bathroom, ran a fast bath, got them through the routine that was the same in every city because routines were the one thing that traveled. Teeth, faces, clean clothes from the bag he kept packed the way other people kept fire extinguishers, not hoping to need it but knowing. All 3 were asleep within 15 minutes of horizontal. Riven stood over the beds for a moment in the dark room, listened to them breathe. Then he went back out. Orion was in the kitchen with both hands around a mug of something warm that he wasn't drinking. He was looking at the surface of the table with the specific, unfocused expression of someone whose brain is running too fast to land anywhere. Riven sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a while. That was something they used to be able to do. Sit in quiet without filling it. There had been whole evenings like that before everything. Orion reading on the couch, Riven at the table with something he was working on, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to prove they were comfortable with each other. That felt like it belonged to different people now. Sage asked me if you were going to be here tomorrow, Riven said. Orion looked up. I told him I didn't know. Riven turned his mug slowly on the table. He said okay. Then he went back to looking at the ceiling, which is what he does when he's decided to accept something he doesn't like. He's like that, Orion said. Not quite a question. Since he could talk. Riven's mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile but the shadow of one. He decided at around age 2 that feelings were useful data and he would process them privately and move on. No idea where he got that from. Orion looked at him for a moment. Then he made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a laugh, short and involuntary, and covered his mouth with one hand like he wasn't sure he had the right to it. Crew is different, Riven continued. He wants everyone to know everything he's thinking at all times, and he does not understand why this isn't the universal default. And Levi just wants to know if there are dogs nearby. Any situation, first question, where are the dogs? Orion laughed properly this time. It was small and tired and real, and something in the room changed its temperature when he did. Then the quiet came back. Heavier this time. I missed everything, Orion said. Riven didn't argue with it. Yes. Their first words. Walking. Whatever Levi's first question was. I'm guessing it was about a dog. He pointed at one through a window at 2 months old and made a sound. I'm counting it. Orion pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. Held it there for a beat, then put his hand down. I'm angry, he said. I need you to know that. I'm angry in a way that isn't going to go away fast, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But I also, he stopped, looked at the table. I also hear what you were carrying, and I know you were terrified. And I don't know how to hold both of those things at the same time, and I'm going to need time to figure it out. That's fair, Riven said. It might take a while. I know. And I need to be around them. Whatever we figure out about the rest of it, I need to be in their lives. Starting now. Yes, Riven said. No hesitation. No negotiation. Yes, of course. That was never something I was going to argue about. Down the hall, a sound from the bedroom. Not crying, something smaller. One of them was shifting, turning over. The small, restless sounds of a child who was sleeping but hadn't fully settled yet. Riven was up immediately. Habit. His body responding to child sounds the way it had been conditioned to respond over 4 years. He was halfway down the hall before the sound had finished. Orion stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go. Kael came out of the back room a moment later. He'd been on calls for the last 2 hours. Orion had heard his voice, low, controlled, giving instructions in the particular language of people who are used to being understood the first time. He had a tablet in one hand and a slight tension around his jaw that he was managing well, but that Orion could read because he had learned how to read Kael the way you learn to read anything that matters to you. "Security is configured," Kael said, quiet enough not to carry. "3 teams. 2 on the perimeter, 1 in the building. Nobody comes in without my direct authorization." Orion nodded. Kael stood beside him in the doorway, looked down the hallway at the closed bedroom door. "He's good with them," Kael said. "Yes. However he's been managing well. Those children are grounded. They're scared in some ways, but they're not broken. That took work." Orion looked at him. "You sound almost like you respect him." "I do respect him," Kael said, without any particular inflection. "What he did wasn't right. But it wasn't nothing either. He kept 3 children alive and intact for 4 years while someone was looking for them. That's not an accident." Orion leaned against the doorframe. From the bedroom, Riven's voice came low through the wall. Not words, just tone. The particular soothing frequency of a parent settling a child back down. And then quiet again. Kael looked at Orion. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was still even, still measured, but there was something underneath it. "About your past. The syndicate connections, the heat records, the exposure points. I needed to know that when I asked you to build a life with me." Orion didn't look away. "I know. I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying it because going forward there can't be parts of your life that I don't have access to. Not if I'm going to protect all of you." "All of you." The word landed quietly. Orion registered it. "You're including them," he said. "They have your eyes," Kael said. Simply. As if that explained everything. As if that was both the beginning and the end of the calculation. Riven came back out of the bedroom. He saw Orion and Kael standing together in the kitchen doorway. He read the room quickly, the way he read everything, and he slowed his pace. "Levi had a nightmare," he said. "He's back down." Kael nodded once. Then he looked at his tablet. "I need both of you to see something." He set it on the kitchen table. The screen showed a security alert, time-stamped 11 minutes ago. A perimeter notification. One of the cameras on the building's east side had flagged movement. The footage showed a figure on the far side of the street, standing in the shadow of a doorway, face obscured. Still, not walking past, just standing, watching the building. The figure had been there for 6 minutes before the alert was generated. By the time the team went to check, the doorway was empty. Riven's face went the particular blank that it went when he was controlling fear rather than not feeling it. "Someone accessed Riven's old identity files," Kael said. 2 hours ago. Out of a federal database that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside of 2 specific agencies. He looked at both of them. "This is not a media story. This is not someone who saw footage and put 2 and 2 together. This is a coordinated operation that has been running for longer than tonight." The 3 children slept down the hall, breathing slow and steady. And outside, somewhere in the dark city, someone had just confirmed the location they were looking for. If you were in Orion's position tonight, finally finding out the truth, finally meeting the children who carry your face, what would you do next? Would you run or would you stand your ground? Tell me in the comments what you would do, because the choice Orion makes next changes everything for everyone in that apartment. The name on the file was wrong. That was the first thing Kael's analyst flagged at 6 in the morning. Not the access itself, not the timestamp, not the agency signature that didn't quite match the standard federal formatting. The name attached to the data pull was wrong. It belonged to a retired case officer out of Chicago who had been off the active rolls for 11 years. Someone had used a dead credential. Someone had known exactly which ghost account to reach through. That kind of knowledge didn't come cheap. Kael was at the kitchen table when the report came through. Coffee he hadn't touched. tablet propped against the fruit bowl. The apartment was still quiet. Riven and the boys hadn't come out yet, and Orion was asleep on the couch under a blanket that Kael had placed there at some point in the night without waking him. The small domestic detail of it sat in the corner of Kael's awareness while the rest of him read the report line by line. He read it twice. The second read was slower. He went line by line, cross-referencing the timestamps against the access log that his analyst had attached as a secondary file. The federal database had been accessed at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. The ghost credential had been active for less than 90 seconds. In and out clean, no flags tripped, no automated alert generated. That wasn't luck. That was someone who had tested the system beforehand. Someone who had run a dry pass at some earlier point to confirm the credential would work and the response time of the automated monitoring before they executed the actual pull. Planned, rehearsed, professional. 3 organizations in this country had the technical capacity to move through a federal database at that speed without triggering a flag. Kael had people inside 2 of them. He knew who to call. Then he pulled out a different phone. Not his regular one. The one that lived in the inside breast pocket of his coat and never got used for anything that didn't require a specific kind of privacy. The number it called was stored under a single initial, no name, no other identifying information. He made a call that lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds. When he came back to the table, his face was the same as always. Contained. Directed. But his jaw had a tension in it that Orion, walking in from the living room with sleep still on him, clocked immediately. "What happened?" Orion said. Not a question. Kael turned the tablet to face him. Orion read it standing up. His expression moved through several stages, confusion, then comprehension, then something colder and more settled than either of those. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Black market genetics trafficking," Kael said, and the words landed flat and heavy in the quiet kitchen. "The network has been operating for at least 8 years. They identify high-value omega biology, dominant lineage, documented heat cycles, specific hormonal profiles that indicate high probability of producing alpha offspring. They catalog them. They watch them. And when a pregnancy occurs that fits their criteria," he paused, "they move on it." Orion was very still. "Your heat records were in a database that you never consented to," Kael continued, "from a clinic you used 6 years ago. The clinic's data was accessed without your knowledge and sold into a broker network. By the time you and Riven were together, there was already a profile on you. They already knew what you were capable of producing." The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, one of the boys made a small sleeping sound. "They knew," Orion said, "before Riven did. Yes. They knew I was pregnant before I knew." The clinic system flagged hormonal changes consistent with early conception. That flag generated an alert in the broker network. The alert was received and actioned within 72 hours. Kael let that settle. Riven's disappearance wasn't him getting lucky. He moved fast enough that they lost the trail temporarily. But they never closed the file. Orion pressed both hands flat on the table. "That matters. Pause on that. They never closed the file. 4 years of Riven running. 4 years of motels and fake names and children who learned to pack in under 10 minutes. All of it not paranoia, not overcaution. An accurate reading of an actual threat that had been real from the beginning." "Who's running it?" Orion said. "We're narrowing that down. The network has at least 4 operational nodes. 2 overseas, 2 domestic. The domestic coordinator has been using a shell company structure that routes through 3 separate financial instruments. It's clean work, it's been running for a long time, and it has resources behind it." Kael paused. "There is a buyer who has been active for the last 2 years specifically in the market for triplet alpha offspring. High-value acquisition. The kind of transaction that doesn't happen in public." The word acquisition sat in the air between them like something that needed to be taken outside. "Our children," Orion said. "Yes. Someone has been trying to buy our children." "Not buy," Kael said. "Acquire. The distinction matters because the legal framing they use internally is not commercial. It's classified as research procurement. which makes it harder to prosecute under standard trafficking statutes but easier to connect to institutional infrastructure. Kael. Orion's voice had gone flat in a way it almost never went. Who inside my old network leaked my records? Kael held his gaze. Someone who is still active, he said. Someone who was close enough to have access to your private medical information and was willing to sell it. We have 2 names. We're verifying. Down the hall, a door opened. Riven came out carrying Levi, who was half awake and had his face pressed into Riven's shoulder and his arms wrapped around Riven's neck with the particular full-body grip of a child who has not yet decided to be awake. Sage walked behind them, already dressed, already alert. Crew was somewhere behind, judging by the sound of uneven footsteps. Riven looked at the 2 of them at the table. He read the room. "How bad?" he said. "Sit down," Kael said. Riven sat. Kael told him what he'd told Orion. Shorter, more direct. He didn't soften the language because softening it would have been condescending. Riven had been living inside this threat for 4 years. He deserved the uncut version. Riven listened with Levi still attached to his shoulder, the boys breathing slow and steady against his neck. His face stayed controlled. His hands, one on Levi's back, one on the table, were steady. But his eyes changed. Not fear. Something past fear. The particular expression of a person who has been holding a belief for 4 years. I am doing enough, I am keeping them safe, I have stayed 1 step ahead, and is now watching that belief get measured against a reality that is larger than they had calculated. He had been right to run. He had also never been as safe as he'd needed to believe he was. The buyer is still active, Kael said. And now they know this location. We move again today. Riven nodded once. Automatic. His body already shifting into the familiar sequence. Already beginning to calculate what needed to be packed, in what order, in how much time. And then Orion reached across the table and put his hand over Riven's. Riven stopped. Looked at him. We move together, Orion said. Not you packing a bag and disappearing in the night. Together. All of us. Riven looked at the hand on his. Then at Orion's face. Then once at Kael. Kael said nothing. But he didn't look away. And the specific quality of his silence, not withdrawn, not withholding, just present and still, was the most complete answer Riven could have received. Okay, Riven said. Sage was watching all 3 of them from his chair at the end of the table. His gray eyes moved between the adults with that characteristic precision, cataloging, updating, storing. Then he picked up his spoon and started on the bowl of cereal Riven had poured before any of this started. And the simple normalcy of the gesture cut through the room like a window opening. Crew climbed into his chair, squinted at his bowl, and announced that he wanted eggs instead. Nobody laughed, but something in the room released a breath it had been holding. 3 weeks passed. Not quietly, nothing about those 3 weeks was quiet, but without a direct strike. The security perimeter held. The new location was tighter, cleaner, more thoroughly controlled. Kael's team ran shifts around the clock and reported in at intervals that Orion stopped noticing because they were so consistent they became part of the background of the days. The boys adapted. That was the part nobody had fully anticipated. Not the security adjustments or the public narrative management or the federal contact that Kael had quietly opened through a channel that Orion was not entirely sure was official. The part nobody had prepared for was how fast Sage and Crew and Levi adapted to having more. More people. More stability, more floor space, a kitchen that had food in it at the same time every day, a bedtime that was the same bedtime 2 nights in a row, then 3, then 10. Levi found a stuffed dog in a donation box of toys that Kael's assistant had sourced without being asked. He named it after deliberation lasting approximately 4 minutes and then carried it everywhere with the commitment of someone who had been waiting specifically for that dog and was not going to lose track of it now. Crew discovered that Kael owned an extensive collection of strategy board games stacked in the office closet. He dragged 3 of them out and announced that he was going to learn all of them and then beat everyone in the house. Kael, who had been in the middle of a call, looked at the stack of games, finished his call and sat down on the floor across from Crew and started teaching him chess. Orion stood in the doorway and watched that for a while. Kael had never talked much about wanting children. He wasn't a man who talked much about wanting things in general. He identified what was needed and moved toward it, and the emotional dimension of the wanting got compressed somewhere in that process. But watching him lean over a chessboard with Crew, patient and unhurried, explaining the same rule 3 times in 3 different ways until Crew's face showed that specific shift from confusion to possession of information, that was not a man performing patience. That was a man who was built for this. He just hadn't known it yet. Sage was slower with Kael. Not cold, Sage was never cold. He simply distributed trust the way an engineer distributes weight, deliberately and only where the structure could support it. He watched. He tested small things. He asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. He asked Kael once, while they were in the kitchen and everyone else was in the other room, how many people Kael had working for him. Kael told him the approximate number for the company. Sage thought about it. Are any of them watching us right now? He asked. Yes, Kael said. Good, Sage said, and went back to the puzzle he'd been doing. Kael looked up, caught Orion's eye through the doorway. Something passed between them that didn't need words. The wedding had been quietly postponed. No announcement, no public statement. Kael's communications team had simply let the scheduled coordination calls lapse and allowed the date to drift into ambiguity. The press was still running stories. The narrative had shifted twice. First from scandal to mystery, then from mystery to a slow, grinding human interest angle that was harder to combat because it was constructed from real pieces. But it was contained, managed, not gone but reduced to a size that could be worked around. Riven was steadier. Not healed, that was too clean a word for what was happening, and Riven was not a man who accepted clean words for complicated things. But he was sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch for the first time in years. He was eating actual meals. The gray quality had started to leave his face, replaced by something that was still tired but was beginning to have a bottom to it. He was also working. Kael had quietly connected him to a remote consulting role through one of his foundation's partner organizations. Nothing that required a public-facing profile, nothing that generated exposure. Riven had taken it carefully, the way he took most things Kael offered, reading the terms twice and asking 2 questions before accepting. That also was a thing that Kael appeared to respect about him, though he didn't say so. One evening Orion and Riven ended up alone in the kitchen after the boys were down. They had done this a handful of times by now. The quiet overlap at the end of the day where the house went still and there was nothing left to manage, and the 2 of them were just 2 people in a room with the history between them. Riven poured water and sat down. Crew beat Kael at chess today, he said. Kael let him, Orion said. I know. Crew doesn't. Riven paused. He came and told me about it with the energy of someone who has just conquered something significant. I did not correct him. Orion looked at him. That was right. He'll figure it out eventually, Riven said. Kael will make sure of it. He'll teach Crew well enough that Crew actually wins, and then Crew will look back and know which game was gift and which one was real. He turned his mug on the table slowly. That's a good kind of man to have around children. Orion didn't answer immediately. Riven, he said. I know, Riven said. I know what I did, and I know what I missed, and I know that whatever this is going to look like going forward, I'm not the one who gets to architect it. I'm glad the kids have him. I'm glad they have you. I'm glad they have this instead of another motel and another city and me pretending that's enough. His voice stayed even through all of it. But the evenness had something raw underneath it now that hadn't been there in the early days. He wasn't suppressing it anymore. He was just carrying it out in the open, which was harder in some ways and better in most. Orion looked at him for a long moment. You kept them alive, he said. Yes. For 4 years, completely alone, against a threat you didn't have the full shape of. You kept them alive and intact, and those boys trust you completely. I see it every single time one of them gets scared. They find you first. That matters. Riven was quiet. What you took from me, Orion continued. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't still sit heavy, but I'm not going to spend the rest of their lives making you pay for it either. They need us to figure this out. So that's what we're going to do. Riven looked up. Thank you, he said. Simple. No performance in it. Orion nodded once. Then Kael's voice came from the hallway, quiet and controlled, and both of them went still because that specific voice at this specific hour meant something. We have a situation. He appeared in the doorway with his phone in hand. His face was the carefully neutral face he wore when he was managing the gap between what he knew and what needed to be communicated without causing unnecessary alarm. Night breach attempt, he said. East perimeter. Intercepted before entry. No contact. Riven was on his feet. Kael held up one hand. The boys are fine. Security has been reinforced on their floor. This was a probe, not a strike. Someone was testing the response time. They found us, Riven said. They found the outer address, Kael said. They don't have the interior configuration and they don't know what they hit when they probed. But yes, they've located the building. The kitchen felt smaller. Riven looked at Orion. Orion looked at Kael. Kael's jaw was tight, but his eyes were already working the next step. We are not running, Orion said. No, Kael agreed. We're not. He set his phone down on the table. We end this, here, on our terms. And somewhere outside the secured walls, the night held its breath. The evidence arrived in 3 pieces over 48 hours. First piece. Financial records recovered from the shell company's third routing instrument, pulled by a forensic accountant Kael had been retaining quietly for 6 months. The records showed a transaction chain that connected to a holding company registered in Delaware under a name that meant nothing by itself. Until you followed the ownership structure back 4 layers and found the name of the person who signed the original incorporation documents. Ezekiel Pruitt, former syndicate operations manager. The man who had run logistics for the network Orion had been peripherally connected to years ago. The man whose name had appeared in 2 federal investigations that both went nowhere. The man who had been quietly building a side operation for years inside the scaffolding of an existing criminal structure, identifying it as a research enterprise, funding it through instruments that looked clean on the first 3 passes. Second piece. A witness statement, secured through Kael's federal contact, from a former clinic administrator who had processed the unauthorized data pull on Orion's records 6 years ago. She had been paid to flag specific profiles. She had kept records. She had kept them because she was not entirely sure, even at the time, that she was going to survive knowing what she knew. She had been right to keep them. Third piece. A direct message, routed through an encrypted platform, sent to Riven's oldest active email address. The one from before everything. The one that Riven had not opened in 4 years but had never quite been able to delete. The message was short. 11 words. We know the children are with Fontaine. Final offer stands. No signature. No account name. Just the words and a file attachment that Kael's team intercepted and analyzed before it reached the screen. The attachment was a photograph. The park bench. Sunday afternoon. Taken from a distance, slightly soft, but clear enough. All 5 of them, Orion, Kael, Riven, and the 3 boys visible. Time-stamped. They had been photographed before the public video. Before the social media speculation. Before any of it. Someone had known they would be at that park before they were there. Kael stood in the center of the operations room he'd set up in the building's back office, flanked by 2 of his senior people, the forensic accountant's report on one screen and the federal contact's preliminary response on another. He was in the particular mode he entered when large decisions needed to be made without the luxury of extended deliberation. Orion stood beside him. 2 options, Kael said. We take what we have and we move on Pruitt and the network hard and fast. Kael's people, direct action, contained and private. Clean outcome. Nobody has to know what the evidence looked like before it was acted on. Or, Orion said, or we hand it over. All of it. Federal exposure, the full chain, the witness, the financial records, the methodology they used to access your biology records and build profiles on omegas without consent. We make it public in a way that dismantles not just Pruitt but the entire system that made Pruitt possible. The clinics, the data brokers, the buyer network. Kael paused. That's a longer process. More exposure. Less control over how it lands. Orion was quiet for a moment. He stood up from the chair and walked to the window. The city was out there, indifferent, continuous, running its own operations on its own timeline. Somewhere in that city, Ezekiel Pruitt was inside a building that did not know it was about to have visitors. Somewhere in that city were clinic administrators and data brokers and buyer-side contacts who had all made their own calculations about how much risk they were carrying and concluded it was manageable. They had concluded wrong. Orion thought about a Thursday night 4 years ago when Riven had walked out of their city with one bag. He thought about 3 children who had never been allowed to paint a bedroom wall. He thought about the woman from the clinic who had kept her records because she wasn't sure she'd survive knowing what she knew. He thought about every Omega whose name was in that database right now, flagged and cataloged and watched, who had no idea. That matters. Hold on to that. Every single name in that database. If we take Pruitt quietly, Orion said, the next person steps into the same structure and starts again in 18 months. Different name. Same operation. Yes. And every Omega who went through that clinic is still in a database somewhere with a flag on their profile. Yes. They don't know. They're going about their lives right now not knowing that someone has a file on them. Not knowing that their biology was sold. Not knowing that if they conceive, there is a mechanism already in place to move on it. He turned from the window. His voice was flat and certain, the way it went when he'd finished arguing with himself and arrived at the only choice that would let him live with it. We can't protect us and leave them. No, Kael said quietly. We can't. Orion looked at him. We hand it over, he said. All of it. Federal exposure. The full chain, the witness, the financial records, the methodology they used to access biology records and build profiles on Omegas without consent. We make it public in a way that dismantles not just Pruitt but the entire system that made Pruitt possible. The clinics, the data brokers, the buyer network. Kael paused. That's a longer process. More exposure. Less control over how it lands. I know. It exposes you publicly, he said. Your biology, your records, what was done with them without your consent. It becomes part of the case record. Some of that will be public. I know. It also exposes the children, their origins, their status as documented alpha heirs. That becomes part of a federal case file. That has implications for their privacy for years. I know, Orion said again, the same weight each time, the same clear eyes. But there are other Omegas in that database right now whose pregnancies haven't happened yet, whose children don't exist yet, who have no idea that they've been flagged. If we go quiet, we protect us and we leave them to it. His voice didn't waver. Sometimes the most dangerous power isn't the person with the weapon, he said. It's the system that made it normal. That's what we're going after. Kael looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, because Kael Fontaine did not surprise easily. Something closer to recognition. The specific look of a person watching someone else make the harder choice and understanding exactly what it cost. Understanding it because they would have made the same one. He nodded once. Then we do it correctly, he said. The federal contact was reached within the hour. The evidence package was formatted, documented, and transmitted through a channel that was clean and above reproach. The witness was placed in protective custody before the sun went down. Kael's communications team prepared a carefully worded public statement for the following morning. Not accusatory, not dramatic, but specific enough to be bulletproof. No speculation, no language that could be turned. Just facts, dated and sourced with a direct line to the case number. That night, Orion went and sat on the floor of the room where the boys slept. Levi was down deep, the stuffed dog tucked under one arm. Crew had his blanket pulled up over his head the way he always did, just his hair visible at the top. Sage was on his back with his arms at his sides, sleeping with the same contained precision he brought to everything. Orion looked at them for a long time. He wasn't sure exactly when Riven appeared in the doorway behind him. He'd heard the floorboard shift and known. You okay? Riven said, low. Yeah, Orion said. Yeah, I am. He meant it. He really, genuinely meant it. 3 days later, the federal investigation was formally announced. 17 warrants for simultaneous raids across 2 states. A press release from the Department of Justice that named the operation, the methodology, and the scope of the biology data trafficking network that had been running inside the country's medical data infrastructure for nearly a decade. Ezekiel Pruitt was arrested at his home at 6 in the morning. The clinic that had sold Orion's records was shut down pending investigation. The data broker network had its accounts frozen before noon. It was on every major news platform by evening. The scale of it, the number of omegas affected, the span of years, the institutional layers that had enabled it, pushed everything else off the front pages for 2 solid days. In the operations room, Kael's team watched the coverage with the focused attention of people monitoring something they engineered. Updates came in at intervals. Arrests confirmed. Evidence accepted into the federal chain. Network nodes going dark one by one as the warrants were executed. Orion sat with Kael and watched all of it. And then Kael's senior analyst set a report on the table between them. He tapped one page. One highlighted name. 17 arrests, he said. 16 names on the warrant list confirmed. Kael looked at the page. Then he looked up. One name is missing, he said. The room went quiet. The analyst nodded. The 4th domestic node, he said. The coordinator who managed the buyer relationships directly. The account is clean. The address is empty. They were gone before the warrants were executed. He paused. Someone tipped them. Kael picked up the report. Read the page himself. Set it back down. He looked at Orion. 17 arrests, Orion said. But not all of them. Not all of them, Kael confirmed. Somewhere on the other side of the city, a phone was turned off and dropped into a trash can on a street corner. A bag that had been pre-packed for exactly this scenario was picked up from behind a storage unit. A car that had been registered under a name connected to nothing real pulled onto a highway heading in a direction that had been decided weeks ago, as a contingency, against the possibility that everything else fell apart. The war had taken a blow, but it had not ended. For months later, the park looked exactly the same. Same oak trees pushing their roots up through the path edges. Same pigeons assembling near the benches with the professional patience of creatures who have learned that patience gets results. Same benches catching afternoon light from the west, wood warm and worn in the exact places where people sat the most. Same distant sound of children on the playground equipment at the far end, voices layered over each other in that particular frequency of kids who have no reason to be careful about how loud they are. For months. In 4 months, a federal investigation had been formally closed on 9 of its 17 counts. In 4 months, Orion had given a full recorded statement to federal investigators that had lasted 6 hours across 2 sessions and included details about his biology and his medical records that he had never said out loud to another person before. In 4 months, Riven had given his own statement. Longer, more detailed, covering every city and every fake name, and every night he'd spent calculating whether they had enough distance between themselves and whoever was behind them. In 4 months, the clinic had been shut down. His database had been secured. 31 Omega profiles with active acquisition flags had been identified, their owners quietly contacted through a federal victim notification process, their files sealed. 31 people who had been watched without knowing it. 31 people who now knew. In 4 months, the wedding date had been reset. In 4 months, Sage had started at a new school under his real name for the first time in his life, and had come home on the 3rd day with a library book he'd checked out on his own card, and had held it up to show Orion with the specific contained pride of someone who is trying not to make too big a deal of something that is actually a very big deal. In 4 months, Levi had learned to ride a bike. Kael had held the back of the seat for 11 separate sessions before letting go. When Levi finally understood he'd been riding alone, he had stopped the bike, turned around with wide eyes, and said, "Are you serious right now?" in a voice that was so purely Levi that 3 adults had to look away to compose themselves. In 4 months, Crew had beaten Kael at chess for Real. No gift involved. He had also promptly lost the next 4 games and was constructing an elaborate theory about why those results were anomalous. In 4 months, things had changed. Not everything. Not all the way, but enough. Orion walked through the gate with Kael on his left and all 3 boys somewhere in the radius of 20 feet around them. Levi running ahead toward the pigeons, Crew arguing with himself about the strategic value of feeding birds versus letting them find their own food, Sage walking at a measured pace with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching everything. Same eyes. Same gray. Same slight ring of darker gray at the edge of the iris. Every time. Still. Riven was on a bench near the fountain, laptop open, doing something for the Foundation's Omega Parent Support Program. He had been running the community outreach component for 2 months. He was good at it in the specific way that people are good at things they built themselves out of necessity before anyone handed them a framework. He knew what scared people. He knew what they actually needed versus what they said they needed. He knew how to be present in a way that didn't require the other person to perform recovery in order to receive help. He looked up when he heard Levi's voice hit that particular pitch. "Crew is arguing with the pigeons again," Sage reported, arriving at the bench and sitting down beside him. Riven looked. Crew was not arguing with the pigeons. He was, however, standing very close to them with a piece of bread crust and a theory about territory that he appeared to be testing empirically. "He's fine," Riven said. Sage considered this. "He's going to try to pick one up." "He's fine," Riven said again, but he was watching now. Kael sat down on the end of the bench. He had his phone in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Levi, who had abandoned the pigeon project in favor of running a large circle for no structural reason. Arms out, face up, with the specific unfettered joy of a child who has learned that the ground is safe. There was a quality in Kael's face when he watched the boys that had no equivalent in boardrooms or negotiations or any of the spaces where he had spent most of his life. Something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of powerful men, but that existed clearly in the lines around his eyes. Orion sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Crew successfully avoided picking up the pigeon. He came back with his bread crust gone and a look of scientific satisfaction. Levi finished his circle and came to a stop in front of Kael and announced, with great seriousness, that he had found a stick that was exactly the right size for something and he needed everyone to come and see it. Kael stood up, followed him, looked at the stick with the same attentiveness he brought to quarterly financial reports. "That's a very good stick," he said. Levi beamed. Riven closed his laptop. He was watching Kael and Levi by the stick. The expression on his face had the kind of layering that only happens when something you did not let yourself hope for becomes something you can see with your eyes. "He's going to be good," Riven said. Not loudly, just an observation placed into the afternoon. "He already is," Orion said. Riven nodded. The day settled around all of them, warm and real and full of small sounds. Crew explaining his pigeon theory to Sage, who was listening with his arms crossed and an expression of engaged skepticism. Levi walking Kael to a second stick, which had been found nearby and was apparently also significant. A couple walking a dog past the bench, the dog pausing to investigate Riven's shoe. Riven reaching down to let it sniff his hand. They hadn't erased anything. The record of what happened, Riven's 4 years, the data trafficking, the clinic, the network, Orion's records used without his knowledge, all of that existed. It was in federal case files. It was in newspaper archives. It was in the particular way Sage sometimes went quiet and scanned a room before he relaxed into it. A habit built in motels that wouldn't fully unwind for years. It was in the way Riven still checked the locks twice before sleeping, even now, even here. You don't erase 4 years. You don't erase what fear at that scale does to a person's nervous system. You don't erase what it costs a child to be always ready to leave. But you build something. You build a life wide enough and grounded enough that all of it can exist inside it without crushing the good parts. You don't pretend the weight isn't there. You just make the foundation strong enough to carry it. The wedding had been rescheduled. 6 weeks out. Small. By Kael's world standards, genuinely small, which still meant a venue that required a booking deposit that made Orion's financial advisor briefly sit down. Riven had been asked, quietly and privately, if he and the boys would be there. He had said yes without hesitation and then spent 3 days figuring out what 3 small boys were supposed to wear to a wedding. Crew had opinions. They were strong opinions. They were not always aligned with formal dress codes. Sage had no opinions about what he wore and several opinions about the order of the ceremony proceedings. Levi wanted to bring the stuffed dog. Kael, when informed of this, said yes immediately. The afternoon was starting to pull toward early evening. The light was doing the thing it did in fall, going golden and long and slightly softer, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look briefly important. Kael and Levi had abandoned the sticks in favor of a game that appeared to involve throwing leaves and catching them, the rules of which were unclear, but the engagement was total. Orion watched them. He thought about the park bench 4 months ago. The scent, the gray eyes, the word that had landed like something dropped from a great height. Papa. He thought about what it had cost. All of it. The 4 years Riven spent running. The years before that, the wrong rooms, the wrong choices, the version of himself he'd had to dismantle piece by piece. The weight Kael had absorbed without being asked. The war he'd walked into without flinching. The gentleness that lived inside the containment. He thought about Sage asking how many people were watching. About Crew at the chessboard. About Levi with his dog and his sticks and his absolute certainty that the world was worth running circles in. None of this was the life Orion had planned. He had planned something simpler, something smaller, something that didn't involve triplets and trafficking networks and federal case files and a fiancé who had quietly restructured the security architecture of an entire city block without mentioning it at dinner. But he had built something real, something that didn't creak when you leaned on it. Sage came and stood beside Orion on the path. He had his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, doing his regular surveillance of the afternoon. Then he looked up at Orion with those gray eyes that were a mirror and a mystery at the same time. "Is Kael going to keep living with us?" he asked. "Yes," Orion said. Sage nodded, processed. "Good," he said. He reached up and took Orion's hand. Not a big gesture. Not a moment constructed for its own emotional weight. Just a small hand reaching for a larger one, finding it, holding on with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who has decided where he belongs. Orion held on. Across the path, Levi had convinced Kael to try catching a leaf with his eyes closed. Kael was standing with his eyes closed and his hands out, completely still, while Levi threw leaves at him with maximum effort and minimum accuracy. Riven was watching from the bench with his laptop closed and his arms resting, and the particular expression of a man who has been running for so long that stillness feels strange and he is learning to let it feel good. Crew appeared from somewhere and announced that he had found the best stick yet, and he needed a ruling on whether it was better than Levi's 2 sticks combined. Kael opened his eyes and took the stick, examined it with full seriousness. "Definitively better," he said. Crew looked satisfied. Levi disputed this immediately. The argument was still going when Kael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at the screen. His face did the thing it did when something required controlled response. That particular stillness, complete for just 1 second, like a system pausing before it reroutes. He looked at Orion. Orion looked at him. Kael walked over, calmly, unhurried, not disturbing the afternoon in a way that would reach the boys. He stood beside Orion and held the screen where only Orion could read it. A message, no name attached to the account, sent through a routing method that Kael's team had not seen before, not from any of the 17 arrested nodes, not from any of the monitored accounts. New architecture, built after the investigation closed. Built specifically because whoever sent this message knew all the old channels were burned. 2 lines of text. The missing coordinator. A name finally confirmed by the federal team through a secondary evidence trace that had taken 4 months to fully assemble. The name was not one Orion recognized. That was the worst part. Not a face from his past. Not someone from the syndicate years or the network periphery. Someone new. Someone who had joined the operation at a layer deep enough that 4 months of federal work had only just now surfaced the name. And underneath it, one more line. Calm as anything. Clinical as a calendar entry. She has already identified the children's school enrollment applications. Orion read it twice. He looked up at the park. At Levi, still arguing about sticks, completely unaware. At Crew, presenting his findings to Sage with maximum confidence. At Riven on the bench with the afternoon in his face. Finally still, finally beginning to trust the ground under him. At Sage still holding his hand. The park kept going around them. Pigeons. Leaves, golden light on old wood. And the war. The one they had reported closed, the one they had watched play out in press releases and arrest counts and sealed federal files, had just learned their children's names. All three of them. By name. If the story moved something in you, if you felt every one of those moments, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter when it drops on this channel. Stories like this one. About love, survival, chosen family, and the courage it takes to stand still when everything tells you to run. Those are the stories that matter. Drop a comment below and tell me, what moment hit you the hardest? Was it Sage taking Orion's hand? Riven finally being still enough to let himself breathe? Or Kael catching leaves with his eyes closed? Your thoughts inspire others who need to hear that they are not alone. Share the story with someone who needs it today. See you in the next one.